All right. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here virtually with you all. My name is Zoe Murad, and I'm a master's student at Cornell University in Historic Preservation Planning. And today I'm really excited to get the chance to share with you some of my recent research that's focused on historic stadiums, and more specifically, their classical evocations. So we're all here to think about the question, what have the ancients ever done for us? One clear answer for the American sports fan can be found in the architecture of one of its most beloved games. American football has become as symbolic of American culture as apple pie, and today football attracts the most viewership over any other sport in the country. As a sports fan myself and a student at Cornell, I've always been intrigued by the uniqueness of the architecture of the monumental football stadium that's on campus. This is Schoellkopf Field that I'm showing you here, built in 1915 to house the growing Cornell football program, a program that, interestingly enough, was an instrumental part of the history of American football as we know it today. American football actually began in the Ivy League. So among the nation's oldest universities, such as Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Cornell, etc., we really wouldn't have the mega industrial sports complex that is the National Football League today if it hadn't been for those experimental Ivy League students throwing around a leather oval ball back in the 19th century. And I want to start today by situating us with some dates and context. And I usually hate bombarding the screen with text, but I just want to draw your attention to what's going on in the 19th century as it relates to the development of the game of football. I've specifically chosen this timeline as I was constructing my argument for this paper because what I want to share with you today are the classical connections to this game that has become an American phenomenon. So just quickly, I wanted to think about what's going on in the architecture world, where you can see that the origins of football are kind of bookended by the Romantic movement in the beginning of the 19th century, and then the modern movement really taking off in the early 20th century. And in between all of that, we see the development of the game. It's inherently being influenced by a couple really important global and local events, like the defense of classical education in the 1828 Yale Report, and excavations at Olympia in 1875, and then the reintroduction of the Olympic Games in 1896. It's clear that the 19th century was thinking a lot about the classical world, and it's undeniable that even sport was being influenced by Greco-Roman tradition. So this is the archaeological site of Olympia as it looks to the contemporary visitor. And this is an obvious starting point for the story I'm trying to tell, right? While this site is not much more than a sandy space surrounded by grass, the influence of this site on American football is massive. As I mentioned before, football began at the collegiate level. Ivy League university students developed the game over time, morphing rules and styles of play from games of the old world like English rugby. Curiously, the earliest versions of American football were actually played in open fields, any available cleared land, like Percy Field, pictured here in 1901, where Cornell football players practiced before their own stadium was built. Perhaps there's some deeper connection to be made here between the open playing field of the earliest days of the game and the open hollowed grounds of Olympia, but that's a topic to explore in another paper. The German excavations at Olympia, led by Ernst Curtius in 1875, were very much a topic of global conversation. All across the Western world, news of the excavations spread. It was from these excavations that the world began to learn about the Greeks' method of constructing stadiums by leveling out the bottom of a valley in the shape of a horseshoe. So it's perhaps no surprise then that the first American football stadium at the University of Pennsylvania was erected in 1895 in this horseshoe style, rounded at one end, open at the other, 2 stories of repeating arches surrounding the inner playing field. Next, we see that Harvard Stadium is built in 1903, again in this archetypical horseshoe shape. And in this image, you can really start to see the full effect of the shape of the architecture on the experience of the place, how the colonnaded upper stories lead the fans to their seats, and you can begin to imagine the feeling of a sold-out packed stadium for a Harvard-Yale game. Perhaps fans had a similar feeling as they poured into the Roman stadium of Perg in Aksu, Turkey in the 1st century CE, being among a community of other interested onlookers. In this view here, the stone stadium stands remain, eerily as if waiting for fans to return and fill their seats. In another view, parts of the stadium's exterior remind us of similar repeated arch forms that can be seen in the infrastructure of our own urban landscapes. I want to make note of an important shift in the history of the stadium. The Roman conquest of Greece saw many changes to the architecture of stadiums. The use of Roman concrete allowed for the creation of large multi-storied structures. Roman stadiums were monumental and imposing, and typically found in urban environments. So it can be oversimplified to say that it's from ancient Greece that we get our modern ritualized version of attending games and somewhat religiously following our favorite sports teams, though it's from a more Roman lineage that our venues for these games be massive permanent structures. I want to emphasize this point a bit further. So here's a view of Harvard Stadium from the Charles River, and it's clear that this building has been built literally into the city of Boston. The stadium functions as part of the city, a living monument to the history of America's most popular pastimes. The skyline of Boston frames the stadium in this view, and the stadium itself welcomes the city and its citizens into its world. This is obviously not a new phenomenon. The Roman Emperor Domitian provided the first permanent stadium of stone for Roman athletics when he established the Capitoline Games in 86 CE, building into the city of Rome a space for spectacle and show. The entertainment value and community making was an important aspect of Roman athletics, and seating up to 50,000 people, the Stadium of Domitian actually remained the largest building of its type until the construction of the Yale Bowl in Connecticut in 1914, which of course took its architectural inspiration from yet another Roman monumental type, the Colosseum. And to end today, I want to return to my very own Schoellkopf field, Cornell's Crescent in the Sky, a modern rendering of a classic form that's been reimagined in concrete and adapted to fit the microcosmic city that is the university's campus. It's within the walls of the stadium that we're reminded of the ancient world and of its innate impact on the way we understand sports and society. It's really quite interesting that today we see the world through the perspective of a growing and thriving sports industry, one that's very closely connected with the ancient Greco-Roman world, as opposed to the medieval, the Baroque, or the early modern worlds. As time moved forward into the 15th and 16th century, new types of ball games were created and the nature of organized sports obviously changed. There were no longer monumental permanent structures constructed for these games like tennis, archery, fencing, etc. Instead, transient vernacular structures that have not survived the toll of time. So there's something very fundamental to be said about the power of stone and concrete, something that our contemporary society obviously aligns itself with as we value sports in such a way that it only makes sense to construct Herculean scale structures in which to gather and enjoy following a ball as it flies across the field from one player to another. Thank you.